Okay, thank you all so much for joining us here today for our Artist Run Chicago Curatorial Talk. We're really excited about this exhibition. It's definitely dear and near to our hearts and has a quite ubiquitous history at the Hyde Park Arts Center. We're joined here today by Allison Quinn and Hanna, our curators for the exhibition, and Mariela Acuna, who will be moderating our conversation here today. I'm going to turn it over to them to jump right in so we can get to talking about this amazing exhibition. Again, thank you all so much for joining us here this evening.
Mariela. Hi, everybody. I'm Mariela. And I had the really fun pleasure of working with Allison and Noah on the exhibition. And I prepared some questions to kind of guide the conversation. And as Sierra said, we'll keep an eye on the questions on the chat so that you can ask your own questions. So actually, Noah, did you want to say a few words about the exhibition more generally before we jump into questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who aren't aware, Artist Run Chicago 2.0 is the second iteration of Artist Run Chicago that follows approximately 10 years from our first exhibition. The show bases on artist run practices in Chicago, whether that is through project spaces or more traditional galleries. The first show featured about 30 or so spaces. This one featured 48 at the end of the day. So this one both correlates with the 10-year anniversary and the 80th anniversary of the Hyde Park Arts Center, which started as an artist run space. So in a way, this is our opportunity to kind of pay homage to the artist run model that is what gave us the Hyde Park Arts Center, but also continue to look at the changing and evolving models and work that artist run spaces do in Chicago.
Great. So to get the conversation started, I thought it would be great to hear a little bit about when this project began for both of you. What kind of spaces were you looking for, if that's how you were thinking about it? Were you looking for particular kind of spaces? Or how did conversations begin?
Thanks, Mariela, for rolling these questions out for us. So the Artist from Chicago show started, I think Noah suggested this or talked a little bit about it. In 2009, we did a show called Artist from Chicago. Britton Bertrand was involved in curating that, and Francesca Wilmot and Cecilia Vargas, I think, worked on that too. And it was a way to think about our 70th anniversary at the time, but also kind of calling this history of artist run spaces as we were an artist run space, like Noah said. This iteration 10 years later, I never thought really that we were going to do another one of them, but it became clear 10 years later that I felt the kind of climate had changed a lot. And what happened in a great way was that the first Artist Run show ended up becoming a kind of document or time capsule, and I'm hoping that this one does the same, and that we like pause time and we kind of accumulate this information so that people 50 years down the road can find a kind of trace of spaces and hopefully lead that to unpack other spaces. But when we were thinking of how to start this process, even to do this again, it was important to talk to any of the spaces that were remaining from the 36 that were in the first show. And out of the 36, there are only 6 spaces remaining. So that kind of gives you a sense of the kind of the way these spaces come and go. So those 6 spaces were Julius Caesar, Devaning Projects, the Suburban, Co-Prosperity Sphere, Roots and Culture, and 65 Grand. I did it. I always have to write them down because I keep forgetting they've been here for so long. And so I went to each of these spaces to talk to them about what they felt was, you know, the strengths of the last show, and if they thought that this was a moment to do another show and kind of get their blessing on it and to get their feedback on what spaces they're looking at. So that started a kind of generation of a list. All of those spaces were excited to participate again, and so they're in this iteration. Another thing that happened is a lot of the spaces in the show, not a lot, but a good handful, are also celebrating their 10-year anniversary. So in the process of researching spaces and talking to spaces, some of them said, you know, that show in 2009 really showed to me that I could do this, that I could start a space, or that I really wanted to do this.
I
So
wanted to see if I can.
What? You can't cast it.
so that was a good sign to me too, is that the Franklin wasn't in the first one, but they definitely are 10 years old now. There's some other spaces, level 3, adds Donna, I believe, too.
Yeah.
There's so that was kind of a nice way to revisit that list and to bring more people in. Yeah, slow. Thanks, Susanna. I'm sure there's a bunch that I'm missing. So I'm around about answering your question, but basically we thought about that. We also thought about the geography of Chicago and how we wanted to make sure that we weren't just hitting Milwaukee Avenue, which was very popular in the first show, and that we wanted to expand into the various neighborhoods that have different ways of operating and also different communities to serve, and are doing and have created different models that we wanted to highlight. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything, Noah?
No, I think that like from your perspective, coming from the first show, that was definitely something that like you were taking on, was that, you know, going and getting the blessing from these spaces and getting the idea of kind of where people were at. But from my perspective too, approaching a lot of the newer spaces, it was a really serendipitous experience in terms of, you know, any curatorial work is a decent amount of research, but going to these spaces and having conversations and studio visits and then having those turn often into recommendations. Rarely ever would I meet with a space and not be recommended 5 or 6 more that they had collaborated with recently or were impressed by. And that really was a testament to the nature of the Chicago artist-run spaces, is often how correlated and connected and networked they are. That it's like, oh, like if you know this person, you'll want to talk to this person. And there's all these people in Chicago that are so dialed in, and reaching in and getting to know their networks was an extraordinary experience.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to make sure that we talk a little bit about how you went about curating this exhibition. I think this is a really special project for many artist-run spaces, in part because it recognizes their work, but also I think what is really cool about the show, in case people haven't seen it, is that you two gave artists the space to curate their own kind of show within the work, within the exhibition, that really represents their programs and their priorities. So could you speak a little bit about how you approached this as a curatorial project in collaboration with 50 other groups of people who also had a vision?
It was really fun. No, I'm just kidding. It was really fun. Because, you know, lessons learned again from 2009, all 36 spaces were jammed into the main gallery, the 2,400 square foot space. So that ended up being this kind of crazy packed space. And I remember thinking like, oh, I wish I had more room to spread these out. So this is the first time that we've used the whole building for an exhibition, beside the first show that we had moving into the building called Takeover. It was a kind of challenge that I wanted to get back into and see if that could work. And this was the show to do it because we needed so much space. The process in itself was kind of us inviting these spaces to participate, and then for them to we asked them to think of a way to, how would they best represent their mission or the statement. And that's why you see the wood plaques as part of the exhibition design, because we felt like it was very important for people to know how long the spaces had been there, what their address is, how they can find them, what their website is, so that we encourage people to visit these spaces in better times when they are open. But the purpose is that we wanted to be able to really showcase those spaces and give them enough room to think through how they want to represent themselves.
I think I'm kind of bouncing off that too. We went off like a very simple, like written proposal method, not in the sense of turning down anyone's idea, but just as a means to kind of get an idea of where people were coming from, what they wanted to do logistically, what that would require, which I think was more or less the most curatorial part of it, was simply figuring out like, okay, you have a space, what do you want to do with it? This is what we can do, especially given after March, how things change and how we have to adjust exhibitions due to that. So really it was a weird kind of amalgamation of very hands-on and very hands-off curation, which made for a really unique experience. And I think really gave us a great idea or step into the mindsets and the working patterns of all these spaces.
And to kind of move away from the idea of everyone gets a booth, kind of art fair style, but instead, because that kind of happened with the first show, we kind of gridded it out. So we gave people squares without walls, but that was a way to just kind of process space. And in this sense, we were able to think through what these spaces do and how they could utilize certain spaces. Like Gallery 1 ended up being, we had big hopes of making Gallery 1 directly open to the sidewalk so that the garage doors would be open. That was pre-COVID. This show was supposed to open in March or April, I guess. But then when everything happened and we wanted to get back into the building and have the show happen and work and open it, it was great to have those garage doors because fresh air obviously is something that people feel better with, and it's supposed to be, you know, healthier and safer. So the next step in amending that process was to ask spaces if they had any ideas of how to if they had artists that wanted to work in those bays and work within limitations of having a piece that's porous but bodies can't go through, and that would be also connected to the installation that they're already planning. So the main gallery spaces were more playful, more public, more large scale obviously, but had a more kind of active type of installation. And then we kind of moved it from there in terms of placement and thinking about the connections between the artists that were being shown in the spaces and how those spaces operate outside of our gallery, but kind of in the real world.
Sorry, I was muted. So I also wanted to hear from you and ask about the kind of programmatic priorities that you noticed in what spaces are doing. Yeah, so did you see through lines in terms of what spaces are prioritizing right now? Or not through lines, or really fun surprises?
Noah, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think obviously Allison can speak more to what she kind of recollects from 2009, but a big part of artist-run spaces now is a level of community engagement that I don't think we'd seen previously. And there's a number of reasons why this may be, and I'm sure we can go into it later. But a lot of spaces have moved both into a more professional appearance, but a more socially engaged model. So for example, spaces like Chukamarka, Anna's projects operate primarily as residencies or through community engagement. And I think that was something we we're interested in engaging with, and not necessarily saying that, you know, artist-run spaces have moved away from traditional gallery or traditional exhibition models, but certainly there's a level of experimentation in their models and programming that I don't think we had seen before, and whether that's something unique to Chicago or just in general within contemporary art practice right now. But we were particularly drawn to that, finding a kind of spectrum between spaces that are operating or have operated as traditional white cubes, and those who have moved entirely away from the exhibition format. And then through that, being able to see both how this has been done, seeing as a way to look at different models, but also a kind of testament to the scope of artist-run spaces as a practice.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to emphasize too that when we were trying to narrow the scope, because really the show could exist, there could be 200 spaces here. I mean, there's so many different ways you could put this together. As we were trying to like narrow down the vision, we were also thinking about spaces that prioritize or that show artwork, that are exhibition venues, and then they could be other things, but that they definitely aim to provide a platform for discussion of artwork and showing artwork. But then, you know, it was really kind of fun to find other models like Sweetwater Foundation, that is a urban garden and a community building space that's outdoor, and that has an apprenticeship program and has so many other levels to it, but also prioritizes working with artists in the environment. And then there, you know, and then we even included Silver Room, which is a shop on 53rd Street that used to be in Bucktown and is a jewelry space or jewelry business, also clothing and other things, but they dedicate their wall space to showing artwork. And then they have a big block party. I think they're now in their like 7th or 8th year of this block party, which has been a huge community boosting art, music, kind of dancing space that we ended up including a video of that made by a filmmaker that they've collaborated with Brandon Brody to show as a representation of their space in the exhibition. So that it kind of pulls out the idea that it's not just you know, a studio space that's converted into a gallery to show other people's work, and that's very important, and that's definitely in here, but that it could be someone's apartment like Rootwork, where Tracy Hall you know, focus on like a spiritual quality of artwork and community building, so that, you know, it could go on and on and on, but we had to stop it somewhere, and it was a way to pick models that could extend our imagination of what an artist-run space could be, in addition to the white wall galleries like Document and 65 Grand. That 65 Grand was in one of the original spaces.
Great. The other thing that I think you've touched upon a little bit, but I think is important about this show, is that the exhibition itself makes visible and kind of tangible the networks of collaboration and support that artist-run spaces rely on, and helps these spaces thrive. Could you share some insights about the kind of networks that you noticed that became visible to you, and how important these networks are in Chicago's creative community?
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that the more naturally it happened, or the more naturally these networks came out, the happier I was with the project. And the more like I felt like I had found something to really engage with. Aside from the spaces that, you know, I'd continued from 2009, it was interesting looking at the kind of narrative surrounding like the survival and demise of artist-run spaces. I remember kind of when I first bring up the topic that only 6 spaces had survived since 2009, there was this real feeling like, oh, this is a really, a precarious position for these spaces or for these artists. But as you get to know them, you find that really very few of them disappear, and more that they simply evolve into new projects with more new people. And something that really came out as late as installation was finding these moments in which spaces and artists had correlated kind of unexpectedly. A good example I kind of came across late was the relationship between Compound Yellow and the Suburban and Fourth Ward Project space and Julius Caesar, who all had a similar base of founding board members, but ultimately ended up showing with different spaces in this show. And then the Suburban's inclusion of a work by Dana DeGiulio, who crashed her car into the side of the Suburban when it used to be in the space that Compound Yellow now operates. And this idea of kind of transferring of power and transferring of space was always something that interested me. And I liked when that occurred in a kind of natural setting through the progression of artworks and the trajectories of artist practice.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to also, so we had, all these spaces. I don't know how much they knew who was in it, even though we did have, part of the process was getting everyone together in November of last year to kind of introduce the idea and to go through how we were thinking through it. And so we invited the spaces and to Co-Prosperity for some Korean Polish food and beer, and just to like answer some questions and have this conversation. And how many of the people kind of knew each other from other lives, either showing in each other's spaces or watching each other's programs and always wanting to connect with them, but never having the time, because artists who run spaces are also doing 3 other jobs and have little time to kind of get out as much as they want to. But there was this like geography of the city that popped up, or more like a geology, I guess we could say, of like spaces going into other spaces. Like you're talking about Suburban, Compound Yellow. I think Shane Campbell might have even been in the Suburban space at some point. But and Shane can correct me because he's on here, but also Anna's getting their space from Prairie, which is also in the show. So that there's like this passing of the baton in a nice way that I feel like gets to the sentiment of Chicago and this network that wants to help each other out, that always is looking to kind of work together, and to, even though the last show was all about like DIY culture and do-it-yourself ways of existing, I feel like it's more now this phase is like do it together because of our resources being limited or our spaces being limited, it's just we know that it's easier when you have other people to make these big projects with. An example of that is how we were able to collaborate with Lumpen Magazine and Public Media Institute on the publication for this exhibition, which I have here now. It is now out. It is at the Art Center. We got it, I think, a couple days ago. So if you're there, or if you came already and you need it, just let us know. It is also at Buddy at the Chicago Cultural Center. There as an installation of Public Media Institute selling artist work in a space called Buddy, which I think is also an older space's name that they've revived. And then I've also given copies to some other of the spaces. And if any of you on here that are in the artist run spaces in the show or any other artist run space, you can grab a stack and distribute it. It's a really nice publication in that it extends beyond Artist Run Chicago list. It's opened a map up for other people to insert their own spaces in. And really the reason why I wanted to do the show again is to bring attention to these spaces that people need to patronize, people need to donate to, they need to support, they need to visit. And a lot of times they don't even know they exist. They could be their neighbor, and they they just didn't think that it was something that they could go to. But that was what we wanted to do with a bike tour. If we were in normal times, we were going to try to do, and maybe we'll do in 2021 when things get better. But we did it in 2009, and it was always a great experience. We ran several of those. And thinking about that, I also want to bring attention to Max Guy and Andy Crest, who were really instrumental in putting together the list and to think about spaces and these models with us. They're also on staff at the Hyde Park Art Center. Several of the spaces involved in the show are artist-run spaces by artists on our staff. So that was a new bonus this year. As opposed to 10 years ago, we've been trying to think about how we can get back to including artists in the process of the administration of the institution, of its programming. Sierra McKissick, who is our announcer voice, runs AM/FM, and AM/FM's in the show. Jackie Guerrero, who works as our registrar, I believe, is a part of the duo that makes Trapiteca, who's included in the show. And then our director of education, Mike Norris, is the founder of Chicago Art Department, who's also in the show. So it was really important to show those networks too, about how artists can be at all different levels in administration and running things, but also running their own space and participating in the conversation about art making in Chicago.
Great. Noah, you, Allison talked a little bit about this, but is there anything you want to say about the ways, these ways of organizing and how they speak to Chicago's culture more broadly?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. And I've been asked it before, and it's difficult to answer sometimes because it's all I know in terms of, like, you know, in our community that I've come to be raised in and had the pleasure and the blessing to be part of. You know, I don't know, and I think in some capacities it's a matter of talking to the artists themselves, since they all represent so many different opinions and perspectives and backgrounds. There's certainly something about being in Chicago, not being in New York or LA, that brings out a certain type of artist, and in a way a sort of DIY, kind of at times funny or satirical way of making art, that still falls into a very professional, very deep and considered practice as well. And I think, I don't know, I think it's something that we kind of saw throughout this as we see these spaces that have existed for a long time and how they've managed to keep that model going, but also spaces that in recent years have built off of those models and explored more complex themes and considerations, things like post-colonialism and racial disparities, issues of housing. And I think there's something to be said for that. I don't know if in a place as large as New York or even in Los Angeles or in London that you'd see that kind of community and that level of both kind of like inspiration, but independence as well. You know, knowing that like I'm here because I care about Chicago and I care about what happens here. You know, I could easily go someplace else if I just wanted to do art. So I think that creates a really unique model. But, you know, time will tell how that holds up and how that will change. You know, as Allison said too, we really hope that an exhibition like this not only serves as a document for our current moment, but also inspires people to take up that as well and to kind of continue that evolving relationship surrounding artisan spaces.
Yeah, another thing that I thought also has a lot to do with how these spaces kind of are born out of ideas, right? Is the fact that Chicago has so many good MFA programs. So that is a huge space for people or artists to get to know each other and for ideas to be conceived and grow and encouraged and then supported.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. This is the network that's kind of underneath it all. You know, this is kind of the pool of artists that are experimenting and taking risks and trying things out in these spaces that then kind of hopefully move on to, you know, MOCP or MCA or Art Institute or Hyde Park Art Center. Like this area deserves attention for encouraging artists to take those risks and to give them that space to play, which is really important. Another thing, thinking about kind of, you know, Chicago and what these spaces are, one of the kind of ideas I was thinking of the next iteration of Artists Run Chicago would be like the Midwest, or how these other spaces are different models that exist in other cities. But at the end of the day, I ended up focusing back on Chicago because there was so much need to highlight these spaces, and that there were so many spaces to kind of pull in, and that were hungry for this type of project, that it really kind of gave me the answer of like, well, then that's not the show that we need to do now. This is the show we need to do now to talk about these spaces. But, you know, some spaces like, I know Holly's on here, Tiger Strikes Asteroid is a space that does have iterations of itself in different cities, in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, so that they've created their own network that spans the country, and they are constantly in conversation, and they use a funding model that connects all those spaces, and that I think is a really interesting model in itself too. We can ask her more about that, but you know, there's so many different ways to do it, and that was what I was hoping to be able to talk about more with our teens and the younger generation, to say, you know, there's no wrong answer here. These are opportunities to think through what the next model could be. Yeah.
Great. Is there anything else you two want to share before we ask our audience if they have any questions?
Not really. Thank you for listening.
Great. Does anyone in the audience have questions for Allison and Noah?
Around here. I do want to, I can only see a few of you, but I do want to highlight some of the people that are here that are in the spaces. I see 062 Gallery that's in Bridgeport, SY probably is on here. I see Susanna Papish, who runs Boundary in Beverly. And I already said Holly Cahill, who is involved in TSA. I'm trying to expand it to see who else that we have here. If I missed you, please pipe up. But, you know, I think really we wouldn't have been able to do this if people didn't want to take I know everyone is so busy. So it was really nice to be able to feel that everyone wanted to support this show, and they really wanted to do it. And even with the pandemic that happened and that closed our doors for 3 months, and that it made it really challenging to get everyone in socially distanced. I think we tallied it up, and there's over 230 artists in the show, and that means there's over 320 artworks. Doing that in a time when no one's supposed to be in the space together, and everyone's supposed to be constantly washing their hands and not touching things. It was a real challenge. But most of all, it was that people wanted to see each other. And that's usually the beauty of installation, where artists get to meet each other, have conversations, get to, you know, talk shop a little bit. And this was the kind of downside of doing it now. We weren't able to do that. but I appreciate everyone who did stick through and do it. Out of the spaces that we did have on the initial list, only one completely like pulled out in the end because of being too overwhelmed by the moment and wanted to reconsider their kind of energy. So that also shows to me that art is really important right now. I mean, I know it to myself, but I think it's really important to these spaces and these artists that are making these spaces chug along.
Yeah. So we have 2 questions in the chat. Actually, one is from Susanna asking, saying that they would like to know more about TSA's structure and how one establishes a branch in another city or location. I don't know if that's a question more for.
It's a great question, and it looks like Holly's ready to talk.
Holly. Hi, everyone. I meant that for Holly. Yeah, I wasn't sure I was going to be drawn out in this discussion, but I have enjoyed it so much, and I'm really excited about the second iteration of Artist Run Chicago. So very proud to be part of it through TSA. And basically, so let me look back at the question here. How it's structured. Okay, so it was a very organic thing that happened, as things are, I think, in these sort of situations. But the first Tiger Strikes Asteroid opened in Philadelphia. And one of the founders moved to New York, and instead of start something kind of completely new, he still wanted to be a part of that original space and that network of artists. Yeah, so he opened a second location in New York, in Brooklyn. And then a friend that he met along the way, who used to, live in Chicago, Carl Barata, some of you guys might know him. He was like, hey, I'd like to start one too. So, he started one. Mark Brusso is he was a member of the LA branch, and now he's in Greenville for, family reasons, and he teaches there. And he wanted to open one as well. So, they were all kind of tight in different ways. And then in Chicago, Anna Coons and Michelle Wassen, Anna was a really big supporter of what Alex, who's the network founder, was doing. She's like, we should open something in Chicago. And so, they kind of bounced things back and forth, her and Alex, for a while. And then they opened the space, after inviting a number of artists in the community. So it just sort of happened. But now we have this kind of very large network in a way, because there are approximately, 6 to 10 people, sometimes a little bit more or less in each location, and we can gather together and meet as a network. We do have director meetings where we just kind of, each couple representatives from each location meet. But there are opportunities to do exchanges, through our different locations. And there's been other things that have come up too. We did a 10-year anniversary project, which, in Chicago, we're not 10 years old, but in the network we are. So we just celebrated that. We did a part archive, part fundraising project as a network together. So even though we do operate independently, we have opportunities where we can, share resources and share funding. And that's also been the case and very generous, I think, too, as well. So I don't want to go on and on, but let me know if that answers, hopefully that answers some questions.
Well, one other question, Holly, do you also share artists?
What do you mean by that?
Meaning, like, do you give recommendations of Chicago artists for the other spaces and the other TSAs in other cities to show? Do you guys swap shows and kind of bring artists around to each venue?
Well, we have in different ways. It's not so much like showing other members' works, and we have done some member shows, but we sort of, want to be more supportive of our community overall. But in efforts like Groundwork, which was this part archive, part fundraising project. Each of the locations put forward artists from the community, and then we asked them basically to offer up some work that was not their kind of primary work that they would show in an exhibition, but more of their sketches and kind of more behind the scenes type of work. And then part of that was basically donated to the New York Public Library. So it's part of their archive. And then the other part was auctioned off. So in that case, we definitely pulled artists from the community and shared that across the network. But we don't, I mean, we've never suggested like, LA, you guys should do a show of this Chicago artist. We've never done anything quite like that. And maybe that has happened, but I don't think that's, you know, more so the case.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
And then we also have a question from Mega, who is asking if you've discovered any other novel sustainable models for supporting and funding artist-run spaces in Chicago that could lead to their longevity and reduce precarity. Good question.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one because, you know, I think some of them have made the jump to be commercial spaces, but only because, like, I'm thinking of Bill 65 Grand and Aaron Gantz at Document, because they really like it. Like, you know, they make money, yes, but they really like it. And then the kind of smaller spaces, the scrappier spaces, usually are doing it out at like Slow. Paul's doing it out of the front of his house. That's a storefront. So, you know, it's a constant struggle, but it's a work of passion. And like Susanna here does it in her garage, and I'm sure she's looking for funding models too. We haven't found anything that is like, you know, a golden goose or anything. I think these artist-run spaces are operating out of just a commitment to helping their fellow artists be shown and get recognition.
I think too, it's been interesting learning, like thinking about the terms like longevity and precarity. With some of these spaces, that's what they want. I know that there exists a certain level of autonomy that you get when you're not a 501c3 or not a commercial gallery or not beholden to a board of directors or an institution, that gives them a freedom to be far more critical of these spaces, to be part of institutional critique. I know for a fact that Kyle Johansson, who runs Table, was always very adamant that he'd rather have the space closed down than become anything more than just what he wants it to be right now. That this was always a temporary project. And in a way, it's an exercise in accepting that precarity and maybe the lack of longevity, but not necessarily looking at those things as bad things either. That's part of the process. You know, no series of work as a painter should go on forever. And I think that might be something to take from these spaces too, is obviously they do need money, but a decent portion of them too are just looking to do it as part of their art practice. And when they're done with it, or where the money isn't where they want it to be, they'll move on to something else. And that's admirable. It's terrifying, but it's admirable at the same time too.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to like think through with people how to support these spaces. You know, I think part of that research and like, what does it look like in other cities and other countries? It happens in Chicago because real estate, you can find affordable real estate or, you know, storefronts to some extent. Like, you know, I think in other countries it happens because the government funds it. Here, the government doesn't fund any of it. It's all coming out of, you know, second jobs, third jobs. And how do we help make that sustainable and make it a one job? And even people like Eric at Roots and Culture. I thought he's been there for a while. I thought he was doing, making money, having a job doing this. And I remember asking him, he's like, every year, I think I'm going to close my door. I don't know, like, this is not sustainable. But he keeps going, and he keeps reinventing, or not reinventing, inventing new ways to hold benefit or hold auctions, or have dinners and fundraise. It's a lot of work. But I think it is a way to exercise his art practice and reinventing himself.
I think what happens often is that, this is Susanna, people often ask me if I'm going to become a commercial gallery or go toward a non-for-profit, and that seems to be the fork in the road for a lot of artist-run spaces. Unless you can just keep sustaining it with funders or private money or something like that. That's just a comment, not really.
Yeah. That's interesting that it is always talked about in those two ways. And like, I think this show is showing you many different models of a third way. I think a lot of people are doing it like you're doing it, Susanna, and trying to create, or kind of pigeonhole yourself into one of those models. It doesn't quite feel right. There's something in between that we haven't really figured out yet. I mean, we figured it out how to do it. We haven't identified it in a way that it could be kind of funded in a way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, I think for a lot of artists, and I'm sure people on here would recognize this, is we absorb the work, but we don't think of ourselves as being paid hourly wages. So we just keep sort of doing the work because we love it. And then suddenly it's like, oh, this is my job. And so I feel like the third way is the way to kind of get through it, because I don't feel sort of attracted to either side of non-for-profit or profit. So it sort of leaves me with this, I don't know how to answer that question often. I don't know if anyone else on here has that.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is also how the government defines, a business, non-for-profit, an artist. And if you could, open up the definitions of artist and let these spaces be another type of kind of artist, and deduct expenses for what you would need to run a space, that might start to open up more ideas of how to fund these spaces, or how to kind of grow these spaces. It's just something I've been thinking about. You're on mute, Mariela.
I was just saying that we want to be mindful of time, and it's almost 7. Wanted to keep it at an hour. Are there any closing comments from Noah or Allison about the show?
No, I mean, I hope that people who haven't come can come.
Yeah,
it's been a very steady flow, very like comfortable, meaning we don't have lines outside. There's about 10 people per session, and in that building you could lose 10 people easily. So if you haven't been, definitely it's safe to come in. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the program, because Sierra has made Thursday nights very strong programs for the rest of October. And I think on Sunday is our Center Sunday program, and it's focusing on international conversations with artists here, Chicago, and artists elsewhere. So if you're interested in that, definitely check it out on our website.
And if you have not seen the show, you can make a reservation to see the show through our website.
Yes, all things needed on our website. Make sure you check that out for exhibition hours, tickets, for programs, and as well as links to all of our Zoom conversations as well. We have 4 more Thursdays ahead of us and some great programming ahead. Thank you, Noah, Mariela, and Allison for leading this conversation, and for folks for jumping in and adding to the conversation as well too. And thank you all for coming, and we hope that you have a good night, and we'll see you soon in the virtual space or in real life. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mega.
Thanks, Sierra.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.